The Warm Handrail. The night crew never made a fuss about the mall. If anything, we were too gentle with it. The way you get around a sleeping dog that sometimes forgets you live there too. I had the keys for the mechanical rooms and the padlocks for the roof hatches. I carried a little notebook the size of a wallet where I scribbled amperages and temperatures and which fan belts were cracking, and no matter what we taped over a switch or shut off with authority, the building acted like a person you were trying not to wake. The air handlers downshifted with a sigh. Fluorescence hummed at a pitch you felt inside the ears rather than heard. In the food court, the soft drink fountain hissed as if whispering through its own straw. I took the escalators personal. They were the only part of the whole place where I knew every fastener by feel. Grease under the covers, lint in the combs, teeth on the comb plates, handrail tension tucked away like a stubborn thought. People think of an escalator as something you ride because you don't want to climb stairs. I think of it as a machine that is trying to pretend it's a hallway. My job was to keep up the pretending. We closed at 9 with a half hour for lingering and then a circuit of lockouts. I hung the red tag on the starter at 10 sharp because I liked the ritual and I liked the quiet after. The tag was a red cloth rectangle, a little grimy at the edges, white block letters, "Do not operate." I clipped it to the starter's latch and always tugged twice to make sure it took. The mall in late winter smelled like cardboard and mop water, with a back note of fryer oil that the vent hoods never chased all the way out. Snow stayed grey at the curbs for days. People tracked grit that looked like pepper into the carpet. I wore a canvas jacket with a wool collar that a younger man would have thrown out. It kept the draft off my neck when I went down into the pits. The steel there kept cold like a grudge. You knelt on it long enough and you could feel the cold escorting itself up the bones of your shins. I flicked the controller to inspection on a Wednesday and watched steps creep like you'd see teeth in a zipper, slow and honest. The handrail lagged by a hand's breadth and then caught up. It always reminded me of a dark river. That surface shine with a current underneath it you couldn't see, and the idea that if the light hit it wrong, you'd witness something choose the deeper route. The LCD readout on the panel wasn't much to look at. Greenish, scabbed at one corner where a tech had pried a bubble out of the plastic film the day they installed it. It showed the same thing for years. Ready, run, error, a few numbers that meant voltage or codes I kept on a laminated card. I don't wear a watch. I time things by the machines. I can tell you how long the escalator takes to make a full loop because of a certain scuff on a riser that comes around like a comet 67 seconds with the chain warm 72 if someone has been messing with the tension. I go by the chiller's compressor clicks in summer, counting to 4 for the oil to move before the thing sounds like a truck rolling a dead battery. That's time to me, because the natural kind has been more generous with other men. I'm not one for stories. I can tell you about my daughter without losing the thread. Sadie takes classes over in Clay Hollow 3 nights a week, accounting. She announced it one afternoon over a bowl of cereal, like she was saying she de-painted the back steps red and I ought to be careful where I put my feet. She is 20, stubborn in the way that makes me proud and grinds my teeth. We don't talk about the years that got loose between me and her mom. We talk about how the bus makes her sick if she reads, whether the store still stocks the good tea, and which night she can swing by for soup. She had braces once. I watched the orthodontist twist a screw with the same focus I use on set screws in a bearing housing and wondered at the equivalent pressures we call normal. That Wednesday, the panel showed something it never showed. The numbers blinked and settled on a time that wasn't ours. No colon, odd spacing, like a cheap alarm clock caught between languages. I felt more irritated than anything. These panels hiccup when you have a brownout. Fluorescents go a little auburn, the soda machine burps, the panel forgets what it is and needs you to remind it. I put a hand on the housing. It felt fine. No bark to the rattle. The handrail kept a steady whisper, the steps kept their pace. It was an irritation, that's all, and one I put in the notebook with a date and a box to check when it behaved again. I hung the red tag, I flicked to inspection, I picked lint from the comb plates with a little steel hook I kept in my pocket. I wiped it on my jeans the way I always did because paper towels leave fiber that I spend double time picking out later. Up top at the landing, the glass balustrade had a child's handprint on it. You could always find one, lower than you want to bend. I rubbed a circle with a clean rag and Windex. The rag took the oil and left a clearer smear like a ghost of the hand that made it. Here is where the story wants embellishment, but I'm not made to do that. What I saw, I'll say plain. The handrail moved without the steps before my fingers reached the rubber. Not fast. It slid like someone catching their balance when the train lurches. The steps kept their pace. The rail's inner belt whispered, but there was no bite to it. Your mind has 1,000 drawers to put things in, so you don't have to leave them on the floor. Misalignment, I thought. Maybe the rollers had a burr, maybe tension drifted. You start thinking the words you de-use on a work order because words make the shape of a thing feel like something you could lift. I killed power at the starter. The rail continued an inch past where I expected it to halt, the way a breath continues when you think you're done inhaling. It did not spin, it settled. I watched the shine flatten against the light. I put my palm on it. It was warm like touch, not heat from friction, not that burn you get when you grab a tool that sat too long in the sun. Warm in the way you put your hand on a different hand and doesn't have to say hello. I went down into the pit because that is what you do when the top doesn't tell you enough. I took the ladder rung by rung because some of them had a slick to them from oil that gathers dust and turns to paste if you don't wipe it. At the bottom, the air had a grease house smell tuned out of habit, and there was a chalky mineral note from the concrete. The sump pump had one of those intermittent gulps that makes you think of a throat clearing itself. The chain moved because I'd set it to crawl. I looked at the wall where we keep track of the stupid things, arrows for wiring diagrams, an old joke somebody wrote the week we found the nest of chip bags behind the access panel. There was a word. It wasn't mine. It looked like it had appeared where the dust on the cinderblock was thick enough to take it. The letters were neat, like someone who prints because they don't trust their hand to make cursive. Pause. Do not acknowledge. It wasn't chalk. It looked like a grease pencil, and my grease pencil was in my back pocket, cap on. I told myself we aren't the only ones in the building. We let a security guard walk the route. Night janitors cut a wide circle around us and sometimes like to watch a man work the way you'd watch a snowplow. No one else crawls pits. I told myself a lot of things. An old mark pulled through by vibration, maybe. You'd be surprised what dust does when air moves over it in a certain way. The steps, at pit speed, showed their treads like a parade of small borders. Dust sits there. The shape of the dust collects in a certain way because of the comb teeth up top. You can tell a lot about a day from dust. How many people wore new boots that shed their black off the heels, whether somebody dragged a nylon briefcase over the landing. There were crescents on a step. 4 in a row, the kind you make when you put weight on your toes without committing. They were too small for a man, too neat for someone in a hurry. The hair on my arms stood up as they do when a draft slips under a door. I got angry because that is a way to stand inside a feeling and not drown. I wiped the crescents with the sleeve of my jacket and told my sleeve it was because dust makes me sneeze. You get used to talking under your breath when you work nights. The machine isn't listening. You're narrating your body's small efforts to anchor yourself. I said, don't be stupid. I said, somebody has a sense of humor. I said, it is better to write than to think, so write. I took out my notebook and wrote down the words on the wall exactly as I'd seen them. And I wrote down the time by the only clock I trust in there, which is how long it takes for the chain to pull the scuffed step around twice. 2 minutes, 24 seconds. The letters held while I watched them and then looked a little more transparent, as if the dust resented how heavy the strokes had been. When I came back up, The courtesy chime sounded from the upper landing. We had disconnected that when we did the remodel 3 years back. It's a tone like a polite doorbell. You hear it in your molars. I stood there longer than I want to say. Nothing else moved. The rail did its last inch, like a person readjusting in a chair. When I put my palm to it this time, it was merely rubber. I keyed reset. The controller made a small printer noise because it faxes its sins to a log. And I look at the log once a week to see if it wants to warn me kindly before it embarrasses me in public. The code that came out wasn't in my laminated list. Passenger served. There was a dashed space where an hour might go if we were the kind of panel that told you hours. We aren't. I left the tag where it was because I liked the feeling of a boundary holding. I did not draw a circle around the words in the notebook because it made me feel like I was feeding them. I went home and put my jacket on the chair where I always put it and stood in the kitchen long enough for the fridge to kick on and make that polite hum like someone apologizing for being useful. I slept poorly. I dreamed of something simple, like a socket that doesn't fit a bolt you were sure it would. I woke with grit in my mouth as if I'd been clenching my jaw. The morning radio said the county had issued an advisory for cold. Protect pipes, bring animals in, be careful with heaters. It said it 3 different ways over an hour, as if trying to convince itself. I made coffee that got strong because I forgot to count scoops. I remembered at the 4th scoop and shrugged. There's a point where you decide to meet mistakes halfway. I told no one. I let the day staff ride things in their heads while they counted bills or stacked shirts. I went to my coiled closet where we keep what the supply companies overcharge for and oiled a hinge that wasn't tea-squeaking because I wanted something to obey. I went past the old shoe store where they had left the mirror after they moved out. I tried not to look at myself. It wasn't a superstition. It was because I didn't expect to like what I DC. A man who takes too much of his measure from machines. Mid-afternoon, I took a service call at the storefront with all the candles and ceramic owls. One of the track lights popped its breaker. I stood on a ladder with a borrowed screwdriver that bent under torque and told the clerk a joke about screws that made her smile, because you can smile without finding something funny. She asked me if I'd heard about the escalator the night before. I said no too fast and asked her what she'd heard, and she said the security guy had posted something in his group chat that his niece had seen because she knows somebody who knows somebody, and that he said there was a sound. I asked what kind of sound, which is a ridiculous question in a 200,000 square foot building full of mechanical noises, but it felt necessary. She said it was like a tone, not loud, like a toy when its batteries are old. Then her manager came out with a new rack of owls, and we stopped talking. You can be in a building every night and learn what the day has done. The handles always read like diaries. The trash room tells you more than you want to know about a season. After Valentine's, there are pink scraps because someone tears the bag with a rose thorn and confetti gets everywhere. After school starts in September, the soda boxes multiply because parents are negotiating. After tax time, there are heavier bags because people buy themselves small, heavy gifts they don't announce. I tell you this because I want you to see how what I saw later didn't fit the pattern the way I am used to making patterns explain things. The handrail was clean. I wiped it anyway. You do what you can and you tidy what you can't. The word on the pit wall wasn't there the next night. I wrote that down too, because it felt like lying to not record the absence. The crescents weren't there either. On the 3rd night, the panel beeped once when I keyed it to inspection. It doesn't beep for that. It beeps when you try to do something you shouldn't, like restart after an emergency stop without clearing the latch. It sounded once like a man clearing his throat to start a sentence and then deciding not to speak. I put my ear to the panel. Machine housings carry voice the way bones carry vibration. And if you've done this work long enough, there is a way you listen that has less to do with sound than with a pattern your body knows. I heard a very small ticking, like someone who is nervous will tap the side of a chair 2 times to make sure the chair is still there. I am not sentimental. I did not think of ghosts or of children who had been lost in stores. What I thought about was static electricity and how glass will fog where a breath hits it if the room is cooler than the breath. I thought about refrigerant leaks making people queasy enough to think they heard something. I thought about the fact that sadness has a way of wanting a place to sit down. Saturday, the mall put out a sign by the food court about a closure. It said the upstairs restrooms were temporarily unavailable due to water issues. It did not say that a pipe in the ceiling had split like a lip in cold weather, and we had to shut a quarter of the branch valves to keep a proper mess from becoming an embarrassment. The sign was a tasteful color with neat serif letters. People came up, read it, looked confused, like this news had happened to them personally, and then changed direction with faces like map lines. The closure meant more walking for everyone. It meant more traffic past my escalator as people went to the one open restroom down by the old arcade. I told myself the increased load would shake out whatever small mischief had been in there. The mischief didn't shake. It learned how to wait. On Sunday I came in early because the manager wanted me to look at a blower on the roof, and whined on the roof is a liar. It tells you something is wrong in a dozen different voices, and none of them are the voice of the thing you need to hear. I braced a boot against the curb of the unit and leaned into the service door while the wind tried to convince me I was light enough to move. The motor wasn't heating. The belt had slacked some, but not enough to throw. I tightened it anyway because my hands wanted to do. I kept thinking about something you don't say out loud, that a building can hold a feeling the way a coat will hold smoke after a fire you did not know was in the next town. Back inside, I cut through the concourse on habit and heard the escalator when I was still 20 yards away, which shouldn't happen. You don't hear clean machines until you're on top of them. I heard a friction tone like a violin string if somebody drags a nail along it. It wasn't loud. It was a thing you notice because it annoys a certain part of your attention. I walked faster. The rail was still. The steps were off. I hadn't keyed anything. The red tag hung where it belonged. People walked past, carrying their lives. One kid holding a pretzel stared at the steps the way kids will look at anything that's not moving, with a kind of respect, because not moving is powerful. I took the rail in my palm. It was warm, like somebody had taken a seat and warmed it with their coat. I didn't let go right away. The warmth didn't change. I took my hand away and rubbed the spot with the rag we keep zip-tied to the balustrade. The warmth was in the rubber, not on the surface. That was something my head didn't like. Rubber holds heat from friction. It doesn't hold heat from memory. I made myself go down into the pit because the worst thing you can do is give a machine the dignity of your superstition. The pit smelled like lemon cleaner because the night crew had mopped the landing above and been generous with the bucket. The sump had its same patient hiccup. The wall had something new. Wait, that's not right. It didn't have new writing. It had a wiped space, an oval clearer than the wall around it, like someone had tested how clean their hand was. My stomach made the noise a soda makes when it loses most of its fizz. The simplest part of me wanted to climb back up. The part that keeps jobs wants measurements. I put my thumb in the oval. It fit. My thumb came away dusty in the neat miles of finger I'd pressed down. I wrote the word oval in my notebook and drew a little boxy shape I am not good at drawing to pretend that what I had seen could be filed under drawing. The security guard is named Greg. He used to drive trucks and did a long summer in a city and came back because his mother got sick. I like him because he says hello like it's a favor we offer one another, not a permission you have to ask. I don't know what he believes in besides his 2 boys and the Cardinals. He came by the machine and watched me work with his hands in his pockets. "You good?" he said. I said I was, which is the answer we assign to each other in buildings like this. He said, "You hear we got a big group today? The church with the tall windows is doing some kind of youth rally." I looked up at him, waiting to see how this new pressure would land on my day. More feet, more lint, more small errors. He said, "You gonna start this bad boy up?" I said no, not until I was done writing down what didn't make sense. He looked relieved in a way that surprised me. He said, "Good." "Why good?" I said, which I might not have asked if my night hadn't been what it was, but I wanted to hear something from a mouth that had nothing to do with motors. He shrugged with a big shoulder. "Noise travels funny," he said. "Last night I heard a ding I haven't heard since they redid things. Could be the other one." He jerked his chin toward the west end, where the escalator has a softer run because it gets less love and therefore fewer expectations. Felt like one more person was coming around the corner than there was. He said it the way you tell someone the weather is damp and don't expect an argument. He put both hands back in his pockets as if to prove they had nothing to do with the rail's warmth. "We are told not to talk about the mall as if it's alive. A manager said that once at an all-hands meeting. She had a clipboard and a tone that suggested she would absorb any inconvenient human feeling we brought to her efficiently and file it under guidance. Let's avoid that language with customers," she said. "Buildings don't want things. They do things if we don't plan. We plan." Everyone in that room did a private thing with their face that said, "We will say the words, we need to keep this job," because wanting to keep it is not the same as believing. I think of that sentence sometimes. Buildings don't want things. You say it enough, and if you stand in the doorway at 2 in the morning, when the air does something that reminds you of a person moving past, you'll find yourself saying it under your breath like a charm. The youth rally came through at 4, and the mall made sounds I remembered from before the dead stores outnumbered the live ones. The shoe shop that survived had a line. The kids wanted smoothies. They called each other by names that sounded like online handles, and it didn't make less sense than the names we used when I was their age. They congregated on the carpet at the top of the escalator, and I stood 10 paces back because security prefers the man with a wrench not to look like a chaperone. One of the kids, a boy with a brim bent just so, raised his hand like he meant to test the handrail. It didn't move. He let his hand hover and look around like he'd meant to do something else. His palm left the faintest ellipse on the glass. A smaller hand pressed beside it. Not all at once. It came on like fog condensing. 5 small ovals and a longer smudge for the thumb. I did not move. The boy didn't see it. Nobody saw it. I watched the ovals fade like breath lost in a colder room. The panel chirped. It never chirps. It made a short phrase of sound like a phone trying to tell you re-pressing the wrong button. I put my foot on the access step and felt the vibration in the steel skin through my boot sole. The part of my body that catalogues load, slop, slur, and slack told me a motor had started without a command. I yanked the cover. The motor hadn't turned. Something had. A little light that sits dead in the corner of the board had learned to say hello. It stayed lit while the ovals thinned on the glass. When they were gone, the light went off as if it had known its timing. If you sell a story like this, people ask you about your sadness because in their heads, one explains the other. I'll give you the small pieces and you can put them in whatever drawer you want. After Sadie's mother left, I lived in a 1-room over the bait shop on Brook Street for 3 months because the mortgage and the child support and the gas bill had a faster draw than I did. The room smelled like minnows, and the landlord kept talking about a remodel that never got closer than his mouth to the idea. I learned to sleep with white noise. I learned to carry earplugs for the nights when the truck with ice backed up against the shop at 3 in the morning. And made reverse bell beeps that took your memory of quiet and walked it around like a joke. I kept the house by winter, but the room left a seam in me that gets sore when weather changes. I'm a man whose days run by the tone a compressor makes when it starts. The week after the youth rally, the mall had one of those special evenings where half the storefronts put up balloons and called regular merchandise exclusive. We stayed late to make sure somebody else's idea didn't crash into our machines and make us find a way to say it was weather or fate. I walked my route at 11 with a headlamp because I like to see the floor right under me when you feel a presence, but don't to know if it's about to assume a shape. Headlamps make a circle and you stand inside it like a story you choose. In that circle, dust looks like weather. You see what your light tells you to. I saw my own boot marks and a few tiny depressions where cardboard had been dragged across the carpet and left a trail. I saw a penny and left it because pennies are all signals to someone else. Near the base of the escalator, on the aluminum kick plate where you don't step unless you want me to shake my head, I saw a print you'd call a heel, but narrower. Not small enough to be a baby, not big enough for the boy with the brim. I set my little tape measure against it because I dislike not knowing things enough to risk feeling foolish. 4¼ inches. A real baby foot would be less. A child's shoe dips toward 5. Barefoot. I shook my head because the floors in my building live closer to spit and gum than to skin. I ran the escalator 5 minutes empty because sometimes that cleans a superstition out. The handrail behaved as if told to in a language it had been trying to remember. The courtesy chime sounded once from the upper landing. It is a chime you hear at the very edge of hearing and then wish you hadn't it because it hits the part of your head that wants to turn toward names. I stopped the machine. I wrote down how long I'd run it. I wrote down the temperature of the motor housing. I put a dot in my notebook with the pen hard enough that I could feel the paper give. Around midnight, the power burped the way it does when a pine down the road leans into a line because the wind asks it to. Fluorescence stuttered. The slushy machine in the corner hissed and then tried on a new frequency and found it liked it enough to keep it for 5 minutes. I let my body notice all the small ways this could knock things off kilter. The panel's LCD flickered. It showed a time I wasn't using. I'd promised myself I wouldn't listen, so I didn't. I taped the starter with blue painter AS tape, the way an old guy taught me once, a belt and suspenders move that makes you feel better if not safer. I tamped my hat lower. It was a night you wanted a brim. On the 3rd night after that, I told Sadie I might miss soup because a delivery had been rescheduled. It wasn't a lie. Deliveries always do whatever the opposite of a promise is. But it was an excuse I caught in the air because I couldn't say, "The escalator's acting lonesome and I don't much know what that says about me." She said fine, and then she said, "I need a form signed if you don't mind." I asked what for, knowing she'd tell me when she was ready. She said, "It's just a form." I said, "Just a form." And we agreed with our voices to move past the visible part of our argument like people passing on a narrow sidewalk, pretend they aren't brushing coats. That night, the mall lost heat to the north concourse where the skylights are. Sometimes the economizer will decide after midnight that the air is fresher outside than in, and it will open its little vent door and let a message in. The message that night was that people would see their breath by morning if I didn't lie to a sensor. I took a tie wrap in my teeth and propped the blade. I told it the story of a temperate day, and the machine believed me. In the pit of the escalator, where no skylight makes sense of anything, a word had written itself in the dust again. Not the same word as before. "Hold," it said, with a line under it like someone formatting with a typewriter. The part of me that makes phrases I don't to say out loud supplied a difference with the first word I'd seen, pause, and then demanded to know why sentences were being composed on cinderblock in my building. The right underlined itself while I watched. The dust lifted as if it had been held like paint on a brush and then released. I removed the emergency stop cover as if I had something to do to it besides stare. The stop button is a red mushroom you slap when things go wrong and want to be the person whose action mattered in spite of everything. It was warm. Warm in that same private way. I had not pressed it. No one had been there. If you want me to say that I thought of a child, yes, hand on a mushroom as an image, I won't. That's imposition. What I thought was, now the warmth is moving. What I felt was something quieter than fear and louder than respect. I put my hand flat on the panel and tried to think of a farm with no machines and couldn't tee. It isn't like anything happens all at once. People want it to, because then you can draw a circle in red pen around the part of the day where everything is different. This came on like a refrigerator going off in an otherwise quiet house. You notice the new quiet. You realize the other sound had been there comfortingly, and now your mouth tastes warmer air. On the 6th night, I realized the handrail had a set to it, like fabric laid the same way will develop a bias. When I stood at the middle and pushed down, the rubber gave in a way it used to only at the top. The belt noise changed pitch for the length of 2 steps. The glass at child height would fog if I breathed and not fog if I held my breath. The panel's light found new ways to put on and take off its face. I told myself to collect data and then bring it, nose down like a dog, to someone who would know what to do with it. But the someone was going to be a man whose hands knew computers better than Chain, and I didn't want to trade what I was learning for an explanation that would let the owner shrug it off. By the end of the week, the mall's main entrance lost one door to a gust that had a stupid kind of determination, and we had to close it while a glazier promised us something that would cost less than the last something if we paid with cash and silence. I made a sign. I printed neat with a chisel-tip marker and taped it in a way a man tapes when he has been mad at tape before. The sign said, "Use other doors, please." I felt foolish for how satisfied that small neatness made me. We kept one stairwell open when the escalator was down because the fire code has opinions whether your building believes in its own rules or not. The stairwell smelled like the concrete tunnel behind a football stadium after a rain. Someone in a hurry had dropped a drink and hadn't said sorry to the stairs. The sticky streak gathered grit with the effort of a magnet too tired to be choosy. I liked the stairs, if I'm honest. They didn't pretend to be a hallway. They looked like a job, and a person could climb them and exert himself and know where his breath had gone. A woman stopped by the base of the escalator on a Tuesday, and I do not remember her face, except that her cheeks had the look of someone who has been indoors too long and has been told to go out and touch something. She asked me, "Is it safe?" I said, "Safer than it looks," because I didn't want to say the truth, which was, safer than what you think, more something than I can say. She nodded like I had given her permission to be nervous. She said, "My boy hates stairs." I said, "He isn't alone." Then she smiled in spite of herself, and her boy came around the column from the restroom with a damp hand and a look that was normal and alive and uninterested in machinery, and I wanted to hold that scene like a warm coin. The handrail learned me. That's the only way I can say it. It began to move when my hand was near and not move when anyone else was. I tested this in ways I will sound foolish describing. I stood 3 feet away and held my palm out like the man in a movie who believes he can hold back a crowd. It did not move. I moved a foot closer and felt something like the pressure against your hand when you hold it out the window of a moving car and bank it. I stood right there and kept my hand an inch off and told myself I would only put the pad of my palm down if it didn't move. The rail slid 1/3 of an inch under the skin of itself. I took my hand away and laughed without joy. I told the rail by not touching it that we were beginning to speak each other's names. A note appeared in the service log the next night. Paper, not digital, a strip of thin paper, the kind that belongs in a cheap printer. It lay curled like a sleeping thing on the catch tray inside the panel. I have never seen a strip there. We do not paper log that way. The strip had one line printed on it. Rider, complete. The dashes were the same as on the passenger, served line, which made me angrier than afraid. Machines that choose synonyms have always irritated me. They give the illusion of choice. I put the strip in my wallet because I didn't know what else to do. I told myself I wanted to keep as much of this in one place as I could. Some nights, you eat out of the vending machine because going home means your house will tell you truths you were not up to understanding. I sat on the edge of the fountain that doesn't turn on anymore because the tiles leak. I ate a candy bar and the sound of the wrapper seemed too loud. You learn quiet in a building the way you learn a dialect. The vending machines make a click when their coils return after they've dropped something. A modest little done sound you can respect. The ice cream freezer, which nobody uses in February, has a compressor that kicks in like a motorcycle the next block over. The distant siren that belongs to the night in a town this size has a way of sounding like a man you knew calling your name if you let it. I sat and let the noises line up and tell me that it was their night, not mine. On Thursday, I made a decision like a man agreeing to duck under a rope. I unlocked the panel and set the escalator to crawl with no lights, the way you do when you want to feel the machine with your fingers and not your eyes. I slid my hand along the rail and thought of something stupid. Rivers you put your hand in as a kid, and the way the current feels like a personality. It was warm again, and the warmth checked down the rail ahead of my hand by the length of a child's stride. I stopped and stood still with my palm hovering and felt like the night had moved its attention past me toward the glass. The balustrade fogged in 5 neat ovals that wouldn't mean anything if you were determined they don't. I did not do anything. I watched them. "What are we doing?" I said out loud, because there are times you need your voice to make a shape in air so you aren't the only shape. My voice sounded like someone had borrowed it for a long time and returned it with some grit left in it. The courtesy chime sounded from some distance that felt like only sound can measure. It made a tone you get used to and then hate because it seems to know it's right for the job. I pressed the emergency stop because it felt like a line I wasn't ready to go over. The stop warmed under my palm. The warmth got into my hand in a way that made my arm want to remember being young. I slept that afternoon, or I lay down and listened to the fridge cycle and the neighbor truck and the kind of silence that in daylight has a cost. My dreams wore boots and stood at the top of the escalator and didn't say anything. When I woke, I felt like someone had asked me a question I had failed to answer, and we were both polite about it. I made soup in a pot that used to sit in a different kitchen and wished that kitchens didn't keep memories they did nothing with. On a stool by the hallway, I keep a shoehorn with a wooden handle I rubbed with oil the day I bought it, and never since. It felt like a small, good habit I had lapsed. I rubbed it again with oil that smelled like a shop that sells saddles. I put it back on the stool where I never sit and felt like I had made an offering to someone and hoped they didn't notice. When I got back to the mall, I parked in the back lot where the trucks unload. The lot is rough asphalt with a strip of frost at the base of the loading dock because shade plays favorites. The night smelled like laundry detergent from the place 3 units down that washes rugs for restaurants. The kind of clean that feels like it wants to cover a story, not tell it. I let my boots find their usual spots on the stairs up to the concourse because feet want rituals. I swiped my badge at the service door and the panel light went green like a coin, coming up heads for a man who doesn't believe in coins. At the escalator, I hung the red tag and stood with my hands in my jacket pockets as if this were an animal I was deciding to feed. I keyed inspection and let the rail start its slow translation. The LCD flickered and then gave me a display I expect only from the chiller in summer, a pressure reading. It meant nothing here. It was a number thrown into a room because numbers sometimes looked like competence. I laughed. The laugh didn't sound good. "Try again," I said, which is nothing you should say to a panel. The panel gave me a code that bent its letters in a way I have never seen a sober machine do. "Welcome, late." "Who?" I said, which might be the saddest question I've asked a device. There are times when events happen and your eye doesn't track because your mind refuses to hold 2 parts of the picture together. The handrail moved, the steps did not. and on the comb plate where lint collects the way a tide will make a knuckle of foam you can pinch, dust drew a line. It didn't dance, it didn't swirl. It lay down with purpose from the landing to the first riser, as though the air could carry a pencil. The line turned and set itself into a crosshatch like a little staircase drawn by a careful hand in a first grader's notebook. I watched the hatch grow. I wanted to lift my boot and stamp the picture out. I wanted to talk to the part of myself that names things and ask it to hold its tongue. The mall made a distant noise like a cough. The vending machine snapped its coil back into place. Someone up in the parking deck dropped a plastic cup and it rolled. The escalator's rail traced one more inch. The glass at child height fogged in 5 and then wiped itself clean slowly from the edges in, like a car window clearing when you got the defroster right at last. The skin on my forearms prickled in lines where old cuts once healed. The lights over the escalator flickered and stayed on. In that tiny change of brightness, I saw a reflection in the balustrade that wasn't mine. Not in detail. A shape that owned a next step, a little forward lean. There was no person. There was the idea of a person moving, dissected by glass, into a gesture that found the top of my chest and set anchor. The idea of a small heel pressed against the step beside the comb, patient, the urge to greet rose in me as if politeness were a muscle someone else could flex. My mouth opened. The nerve that drives that act lit up like a leg kicked when the doctor taps it. I closed my mouth because the words on the wall had said a different thing. Do not acknowledge. The emergency stop was no longer warm. It was hot, not burn yourself hot. The kind of heat a sleeping dog holds if you put your hand in the place where it lay, after it gets up and heads to the kitchen because it knows the door will open. I took my hand away and leaned both elbows on the panel, the way a man leans on a fence when he sees something he has no lawful business lying to. In the morning, the tag still hung. The glass looked like any pane of glass that has been cleaned by a person whose heart is not organized by glass. The dust in the pit wall showed nothing, unless you count the clean oval where my thumb had been, which I had not cleaned because I did not know how to erase my own hand without feeling like a trickster. I felt a new emotion that took a minute to name. It was something like disappointment and something like relief. It felt like the day had decided to pretend, and I had agreed. What breaks us isn't always dramatic. The mall released a memo about a promotional guest that weekend. A person from a show, not a real star, just somebody with a face people knew who would stand in a roped area by the fountain and sign names onto glossy paper. We would regroup, the memo said, and rediscover community. The memo made me want to find a pen heavy enough to dent it. I pictured teenagers in line and a security guard relacing his boot and the escalator doing its quiet inching and a mother at the base with a boy who hates stairs. In my head, all the lines met. Friday evening, I keyed the escalator to a very slow run. I positioned myself halfway up the incline, where I could see both landings if I leaned my head like a man trying to hear what you were not saying. The panel undercut the lights with a tone. The tone was not a beep. It was a line of sound you ride to arrive somewhere you've been before and cannot remember the address of. I put my palm on the rail. It was room warm. The warmth moved away, and I felt childish for imagining it led something by the hand. A little girl holding a balloon came around the corner with her father, who wore worry like a coat he had outgrown. He touched her shoulder in a way that meant stopping without saying the word. She looked up the escalator. I felt something like grief that wasn't mine. She reached for the rail, and her father said, "Wait!" And she stopped with her fingers a whisper off the rubber. The courtesy chime rung, soft as breath. The glass fogged where you'd expect it to if clouds were persuaded by hands. The father turned his head to look down the concourse toward the restroom. He said, "We'll go the other way," not unwillingly, just a choice. He steered the little girl around the base of the escalator. She dragged the balloon, which made a little static squeak against the floor. The escalator made a sound I had never heard it make that wasn't a mechanical sound. It was an inward sound, a hum, almost like contentment, if machines allowed themselves that. The memo went up on the break room door about certain words to avoid when speaking to the press who might arrive for the promotional guest. They were not to be alarmed by the closure of the upstairs restrooms, which might continue indefinitely while we waited for a part. We were to direct all questions to the manager, who had a smile that kept its angle even when you could tell her mouth wanted another direction. We were not to gossip about folklore, which made me look at the word until it lost meaning. Folklore usually involves people lying for reasons that help them sleep. I had not been lying. I had been writing, which is different. Inside the panel, a piece of paper waited like a tongue. I pulled it free in one tug because I wanted to see all the letters at once, the way you want the doctor to say his diagnosis in one sentence and then check your breathing. The strip said, "Late rider, assisted." The strip had static to it that made my arm hair lift where it held to me. I put it in my wallet beside the first strip, and my fingers remembered the size of a photograph I'd carried there once years ago. A photo of a girl with braces she hadn't asked for, who sat in a chair with a bib, and gave me a look that asked me to explain all the things I couldn't tee. It felt like something in my chest had hands and had just rifled through my wallet for its own reason. I asked Greg if he had heard the chime. He said he'd heard it, but he didn't want to have heard it. He said if we wanted to make sure there were no misunderstandings, we could lock the escalator and stand by the stairs for the promotional guest day and let the machines feel whatever they felt in private. He said it in a way that made me want to put my hand on his shoulder. I did not. The older you get, the more you learn that touching other men has rules none of us wrote, and all of us obey for reasons that belong to a different century. In the morning, I woke to a text from Sadie, a picture of a form with a box asking for a signature from a parent or guardian. I called her and said, "What am I authorizing?" She said, "Nothing bad," and then laughed because she caught the old reflex in both of us that says if something needs a signature, it has the weight of men behind it. "It's a work-study placement letter," she said. "Just lets me do a shift at a real office for credit." I asked where, and she named an address on Main Street. "It's the old bank building," she said, "but they put a startup in the front corner." I said okay, and asked her to bring it by. I listened to her say, "I can do it Monday," and thought about timelines and about how the word late had been printed on my paper, and had to sit down on the edge of my bed and stare at the floor, because a fact in my head wanted to demand a schedule from a feeling. The promotional guest day felt like a forced celebration of a wedding after a fight. We dressed the concourse in temporary plants that tried too hard. We set up stanchions with black belts that clip into each other in a way that satisfies the lizard part of your brain that liked racetracks when it was 5. The guest arrived with an entourage of faces full of their own lives. It wasn't busy. It wasn't not busy. The line moved and people got what they thought they had come for. I spent most of my time standing by a rail, nodding, reminding people to take the stairs because the escalator was closed for maintenance. People obeyed with expressions that told me we are all store-bought equal when a sign tells us a rule we could ignore but don't tee. We help each other by not making choices we might regret. Halfway through the thing, the escalator made its sound. The tone, the line. It drew my face up as if begging a yes. I kept my face plain and watched for the fog that would tell me a hand was writing what I wouldn't to read. The glass stayed clean. The panel light did its little inexplicable. I felt somebody at my shoulder, and it was Greg, not touching me the way men don't. He said, without moving his lips, "You good?" I said, with my lips not moving either, "Define it." He laughed in a way that could be filed under courteous. We stood like two men watching a river we know and love watching a log float at a speed neither of us trusts. At the end of the day, I keyed the escalator to run and let it clear its throat of all the lint and anxious energy it had stored. The rail took my hand like a memory it had wanted to rehearse. The courtesy chime rang once. I said nothing and wrote down the only thing that has saved me in jobs like this, that people and machines and buildings tell you who they are by repeating certain small moves until you either learn to nod or you leave. You want a breaking point. I did too. I got it on a Tuesday when the county sent out an advisory about a water main replacement uptown. They cut pressure to our zone for 4 hours and the mall behaved like an old man who hates to admit he needs help. Toilets were slow and then sorry. The fountain thought it might want to turn itself on because the one working restroom had a line and the idea of water was in the air. By 8 o'clock, people were impatient in the special way that's quiet and corrosive. The cleaning crew eyed their mops like you look at a child who has disappointed you. I hung the red tag. I keyed the panel and thought, we're going to do this the right way, with procedures that belong to the world where people like me make rules and pretend we crew their authors. The LCD showed its wrong time again in a stutter, a 0 where a 2 ought to go, a blank where a colon lives. The balustrade fogged with 5 ovals and a thumb, and then did something new. It chilled. I felt cold draw off the glass in the way you feel it when you open a freezer door in a small kitchen at night. The handrail cooled under my palm. It did not take heat. It offered cold. I removed my hand and my skin reacted. Goosebumps that had nothing to do with temperature. The panel printed a strip all by itself. The printer that never works worked like it had made up its mind to be helpful in a way that makes you nervous. I didn't pull the strip right away because sometimes you have to let information sit for a minute to see if it changes its tone. I was not alone. A man in a brown jacket stood 30 feet away with a bag of takeout. He watched me because we are the only theater in a town like this that still tries to convince people that effort matters. He put his bag on the floor and put both hands in his pockets and rocked on his heels with a patience that says I could stand here a while or I could walk away. Either way is a story I am willing to tell myself. I looked at the strip because I didn't want to crane my body and let him see curiosity in it. Early entry declined. What does that even mean? I said. The man in the jacket tilted his head like I'd told a joke and wanted him to do the laugh sound for me so I wouldn't feel alone. He picked up his bag and left. In the pit, the word had changed again. I don't mean the characters were different, I mean the script had changed. The letters were in a child's hand now. Wait, it said. I squatted with my hand on the rail where it enters the return so my head wouldn't hit the underskin when the steps come back down. The dust moved while I watched. A second line wrote itself below the first, in bigger shapes like a child trying to remember how adults make capitals. Please! I put my head against the cinderblock and let the wall cool my skin. The sump hiccuped. A remote thermostat called to a unit in a voice only a machine hears, and something above me came on. I stood slowly so the ceiling wouldn't knock the hat off my head. The noise of the mall above had quieted in the way a building does half an hour after closing, when the last sounds are people unlocking their own cars 2 lots over, and a dryer once in a while hitting a zipper against the drum. I had not agreed to anything, but in the way you can agree to weather, you can also agree to instruction you do not respect. I waited. The courtesy chime sounded once. The rail warmed, then cooled, then held warmth like a held hand that decides not to let go yet, and I stood in a reciprocated decision like a man who will only later realize it was a decision. You want me to tell you what I think was happening. I can give you pieces because pieces are all I have. There is a difference between echo and occurrence. An echo is a thing coming back. An occurrence is a thing happening now that looks like a thing you have been told about before and did not plan on seeing. The machine had learned a tiny repertoire, a chime, a warmth, a word, It produced them in a pattern that read to me like a greeting you request and receive if you choose to stand in the place where greeting stands. It wanted a shape to complete the circuit. If you had asked a person who uses a different toolbox than mine, they might have said it wanted acknowledgement. I had been told not to acknowledge. The word acknowledged the refusal. So now we were both polite. It's tiring, being polite to something. What happened then was small and final. The steps, which had been still, moved one tooth. The motor did not turn. The chain did not make the sound it makes when it shifts tension by a degree. The step under my hand altered its set like a person sighing through their nose. It righted itself into alignment with a grace I've never been able to engineer into anything. The glass at child height fogged in 5. The thumb slid. This is where my memory either lies to me or tells me the only truth that matters. I thought I heard a small shoe scuff on the landing. I rose. I knew there was no shoe. I turned my head to see a thing you cannot see in glass and muscles made for ladders. I saw nothing. I felt the kind of quiet that finally told me I'd run out of the kind of explanation that pays your rent. I did not cry. I'm telling you that because leaving out the fact will make you think a hardened man decided not to, and it means more than it does. I did not cry because crying belongs to something that returns. This was a different thing. After that night, the escalator behaved for 3 days. No fog, no strips. The warmth, when it appeared, was an ordinary warmth that made sense to fingers, that no friction. I was worse off for the good behavior. My chest felt like a radio off station. I went home and cooked a steak in a pan. I never get hot enough the first time, so I let it smoke until the smoke alarm made its small, polite fury, and I waved a towel to stop it, and then sat at the table with the steak and did not taste it. I listened to my neighbor cough through the vent and felt like a thief. Sadie came by with the form. She wore a jacket I hadn't seen. It had a fur collar that was not fur, because my daughter is kinder than I deserve. She put the form on the table and said, "Just sign," without looking at the boxes. I read it anyway because I'm a man who reads panels. "You won't be exposed to hazards," it said, and I signed under a line that promised her as much. She asked me if I had eaten. I lied and said yes. She said, "You look tired," and I said, "Machines," and she made a face like she was pleased to have guessed the right word to describe the wrong thing. On her way out, she turned back and hugged me, which she does around Christmas and funerals, and she smelled like outside air and a lotion I didn't understand. If you've been a father, you know the way hug takes your measure without telling it you were being measured. When the mall made its advisory about weather that Friday, I thought, the escalator will want something because the building will tell it a story about people needing to go places and not understanding why the cold makes it harder. The advisory was not special. A low-pressure line and a radio voice that likes the sound of itself saying, "Dangerous wind chills." The mall cut hours by 2 because we care about our staff, it said, and we expect our staff to care enough to arrive on time anyway. The day staff looked grateful that someone had made a decision on their behalf. The night staff looked like a decision had been made for them again. The escalator looked like a hallway that wouldn't admit to what it had been the night before. At 8:15, with the mall proper closed and the last store pretending to count money for a while so it could join the story it liked about hard work. I hung the tag and stood where the rail meets a person's palm if a person decided to make that palm belong to this night. The panel gave me no code. It gave me a reflection of my hands, which have more lines than my father's did when he was my age. The glass gave me a map of the lights in the ceiling and a place in that map where 5 ovals had been so often that I think I could have put my hand to the spot blindfolded. I felt more than thought a request. I did not give it what it asked. I walked away to the stairs and climbed, because stairs are what you do when you refuse a promise you never made. Up on the landing, I leaned into the railing like a man who has climbed stairs for a reason and is waiting for that reason to announce itself. The escalator from up here looks like a throat. You stand where the words live. You look down and see what rises. The courtesy chime rang once and then again, which it does not do, and the hair on my neck scrolled itself into sentences I could not read. I wanted to run my hand along the glass and say something like no. I did not touch it. I used the tone I had used with my daughter when she was 6 and wanted to stay on the swing in the rain. Enough, I said. The building would have heard the S sound and tucked it under itself. The escalator did something that surprised me by how mundane it was. It turned on. I did not wish for a code to blame. What I wanted was the sound that belongs to the start of a motor. I didn't get it. The steps moved because they wanted to move, and the motor admired their initiative. The rail matched them like a dance partner who was tired of the bar. The panel sat still and learned nothing. The chime sounded again, and a woman's voice from the old TD, where no one had made a sound in months, said the word closing in a way that came from a tape made when people said the full long vowels of words in public spaces like they were the landmarks you used to find us. The voice dropped away as if it had meant to enter a sentence and changed its mind. I walked down the stairs and stood at the base and looked up like a man meeting the eyes of a person he knows and has no more talk for. Then I put my foot on the step. I let myself realize the mistake as it was happening and not as an idea I would chew later. The step under my boot accepted weight in the way a small boat accepts a man it knows well enough to make room. The rail warmed under my palm, like a word I had avoided saying coming out of my mouth before I had time to filter it. The escalator took me up at inspection speed, gentle as an apology. Halfway up, the glass fogged in its 5-ovaled way, and then the fog elongated, and I had the sensation that if I turned my head a certain angle, I would find something standing one step below me, equal in weight to any person I've held a door for. I did not turn my head. The rail at my right slid in by a fraction. Something, whatever word you want to use when you mean you and not you at once, aligned. A breath that had not been mine moved in my chest at a timing that was. I said nothing, and the nothing I said was a name not put to air. At the top, the escalator let me off with a neat little bump that I have always loved. The way a well-set downshift in a truck lets you know men have learned to choreograph metal. The courtesy chime offered a punctuation mark. I stood there and felt ordinary. Not better, not worse. Ordinary in the way a man feels ordinary when he has agreed to something nobody had the right to ask. I locked the escalator. I put the tag on. I wrote nothing in my notebook because sometimes writing is pretending, and I didn't want to perform. I went to the break room and poured coffee thicker than good sense. I sat with it cooling in my hand while men who take the late shift mopped their shoes on the rubber and made remarks about nothing that will hold weight in the morning. Later, much later, when I lay in my bed and the fridge hummed like a little hive someone forgot to put outside in summer, my phone lit with a message from Sadie, a picture of a pair of shoes. Kids always photograph from above. You see toes and laces and a floor. Her shoes were grey. The caption said, "New job shoes, proud of me?" I typed proud and then erased it and typed yes without qualifiers and then turned the phone face down because the light does something to a dark room that makes you live there less. The next night I came to work and the escalator behaved. It turned on when I told it, it moved when I asked, it waited when I chose. The panel printed no strips and the glass held only the cleaning crew's arcs. The emergency stop held a boring kind of cold. I wondered if the story had ended. I wondered if all we had done was find our way to the ordinary from opposite directions. A month later, the mall installed a new bulletin board near the main doors for community notices. I read them when I passed, like a man reading a hometown paper he doesn't subscribe to anymore. Yard sale, blood drive, the picture of a girl with braces who wanted babysitting work for summer, I looked at that picture longer than I meant to. The board had neat pushpins in colors like candy. The manager had made a rule, only one layer of paper, no overlapping, and you could tell who respected rules by the care they took not to make one notice look like it was hiding a secret under it. In April, on a day the sky forgot how to keep one color for more than 5 minutes, the escalator gave me one more strip of paper. It had curled itself behind the little catch where screws collect when you take the cover off and tell yourself you will learn to keep them in a pocket. I tugged it free. The strip had a different kind of ink, a fainter black. It looked older. It read, "Thank you." I laughed then. I couldn't help it. I laughed like a man alone in a building who knows nobody wishes him anything. And I put the strip in my wallet behind the picture I'd done to keep there of a girl with braces who works in the corner office now, counting other people's money and sometimes her own. On a Tuesday, much later, the escalator stopped during the day with a little lurch because somebody dropped a coffee, and the sugar in it makes glue in places where glue harms. A man in a hurry swore, and a woman apologized with her hand, and a teenage boy put 2 fingers to the rail and looked like he thought he could scold it. I came with my rag and my hook and worked, which is the only way I know to stay. I ran the machine with the panels open at a speed that would be safe for me and hateful for the impatient. The rail under my palm warmed and stayed warm long enough for me to think of the strips in my wallet and of what thanks looks like when all you have to offer is a well-kept machine. I don't tell this to most people. I'm telling you because there is no sentence in anyone's rulebook about escalators and acknowledgment. And you done a T straight line from dust letters to tickets you can write on forms that get you paid. If I had to say what I think happened in a way that would let the manager nod and file it under explanation, I couldn't do it. All I know is the mall took on the shape of kneading, like a person standing with their hands at their sides, trying not to make you uncomfortable. It found me because I stand in the places people don't, and I don't greet on instinct like the rest of us. Sometimes the courtesy chime will ring once when no one is in sight, and I will look up out of habit like you do when a sound comes from your name. I do nothing then. I wipe the glass where the cleaning crew missed. I touch the rail with my hand, because a machine is different when someone who knows it touches it. I climb the stairs because I like the work. I do my job. I keep pretending, which is not the same as lying, not if it keeps us moving. When I lock the tag at night, the red cloth hangs like a tired tongue, and I pat it twice, like I always have, because I want the last thing I do each night to be the same. And I want that sameness to be mine. I still carry the strips in my wallet. There are 3, I didn't look for a 4th. The leather is wearing thin where the corners of the paper have pushed for a longer pocket. When I take the wallet out to pay for coffee in the morning, the barista has stopped looking at me for a name and just calls me Sir, which is polite enough. I wait for the receipt with my fingers on the cool counter. The little thermal printer spits and curls its tongue. The building behind me, the one I think of as my building even if I done own it and never will, wakes in stages. The soda fountain hiss, the compressor click, a distant doorknob's old spring giving someone the answer they want. If a chime rings, it's for someone else. I walk back with my paper cup and I hang the tag, and I pretend to not greet. It's a kind of love, I think, that does not require agreement. It just needs a hand now and then, and a man who isn't lost to himself yet. If this story lands with you, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone who enjoys quiet, literary horror. Comments are open. Tell me your favorite image or line.